Welcome to the 28 Minutes of Sanity podcast. We're glad you're with us today. I'm JJ. Paul is here today. As always, if you want to send us a note, a question, a comment, a criticism, 28minutesofsanity@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at 28min of Sanity. Today, joining us is Nate Grasz of Nebraska Family Alliance. Nate is policy director of Nebraska Family Alliance. This organization where Nate works, actually, I used to work for Family First up through 2008. Family First is one of the organizations that merged with Nebraska Family Alliance. So, Nate, my first question for you, I left a sandwich in the break room when I left. Is that any chance that's still around? I'd kind of like to get that back if it's still...
Yeah, I think I saw one in the back. We'll see if we can get that to you.
Okay, I would, if somebody's coming this way, just send it out because I could use it right now. So, Nate, can you just by way of introduction, tell us a bit about Nebraska Family Alliance, what you guys do, and then just tell us your story, how you got involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Nebraska Family Alliance, we are the state affiliate of Focus on the Family, which people might be more familiar with. So we're a statewide organization. We're based in Lincoln, near our state capital, and essentially, we're a nonprofit Christian public policy organization. And so our mission is to advance family, freedom, and life, and we do that by influencing policy, mobilizing prayer, and empowering people. So we try to work with policymakers at every level of government to help influence the laws that are passed and not passed in ways that we believe are good for families, good for society, and in accordance with the truth of God's word. So we really strive to stand for truth, both in government, but also in culture. So we provide a lot of resources and information to the general public on how to think about some of these issues that are impacting us in government and in culture, how to think about them from a biblical worldview, and really help equip people to feel like they can go out and make a difference. How to contact your representatives when bills are coming up for debate. We produce our own radio shows, social media videos, all that sort of stuff. So if you want to learn more about NFA or how you can partner with us in our mission, we've got all that information on our website, nebraskafamilyalliance.org. And as you mentioned, JJ, I'm the policy director here. So I'm one of those, dirty registered lobbyists who goes down to the Capitol. But I've been here at NFA for a little bit over 6 years now. And it's been a tremendous privilege getting to serve in that capacity here at NFA. I bleed Husker Red, grew up in Nebraska. I'm a fifth generation Nebraskan. My parents are still up in Omaha. I left for a few years to go out to Colorado Christian University, where I got my degrees in business and political science. I did some work for public policy organizations, worked in radio for a little bit. And then my wife, I've been married for about 6 years as well. She's an attorney, so we moved back to Lincoln so she could attend law school here at UNL, and I was able to walk into a position here at NFA and have been here ever since. So it's been a journey, but it's been a lot of fun and incredibly grateful to get to live here in Lincoln and serve on the team at NFA.
Well, that's cool. Well, we're glad that you're here in Nebraska. We're glad you're serving the way you are, Nate. Something you mentioned in your bio when I was poking around, you mentioned you worked in radio. Did I read correctly? You worked for Hugh Hewitt?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I got to work as an associate producer on the Hugh Hewitt show. So I got to work pretty directly with Hugh every day, which was an incredible experience. Learned a ton. He's one of the best in the business for sure. Just a brilliant guy. So that was a great experience for me and kind of helped put me on the trajectory to where I'm at today, getting to work with him and on his show. So that was, definitely something I look back on really fondly.
Okay. One of the podcasts I listen to is Hillsdale Dialogues. And so I don't think we get Hugh on the radio out here, but I get to listen to him and Larry Arnn go at it about once a week. So
Yeah, those are always fun.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So Nate, a couple things that our people have seen in the news lately that I kind of want to go deep on. I told you before we came on. One of them is Lincoln's Soji ordinance. And could you take a minute, if people want to get a little background on this? You've got an article that was in National Review that was published, I think, February 25th. But before you talk about what's gone on in Lincoln, can you just explain the term Soji? A lot of people might not be familiar with, but what does that term mean, and what's typical of these ordinances? Can you give us a little background on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Soji is short for sexual orientation, gender identity. So when you hear people refer to Soji laws or Soji non-discrimination laws, generally what they're talking about is a law, or like here in Lincoln, a city ordinance that proposes to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And while those types of laws, they sound really great on the surface because we believe every person should be treated with dignity and respect. We all want people to be treated fairly. We all oppose discrimination. The problem is, how these laws propose to do that. And really what we've seen across the country and here in Lincoln is, rather than being used as a shield to stop real discrimination, these types of laws and ordinances are instead used as a sword against people of faith, where it becomes more about advancing an ideology and using the force of law to impose a particular view about human sexuality, where the government is then empowered to punish people, to fine them, to take away their business if they disagree with that particular ideology. And so that's what we're dealing with here in Lincoln. It's been an issue that's been around, for quite a while, but I think it's really increased the last several years as we've seen kind of culture drift a certain direction where these types of laws are being proposed and pushed. I think harder than we've ever seen before, and we're seeing it pop up, all over the place at the school board level, the state level, the city level, the federal level. If you're familiar with the Equality Act, the so-called Equality Act, that is a Soji non-discrimination law. So that's what we're talking about when you hear the term Soji.
Okay. So, Nate, most of our listeners, the big bulk, probably live here in Merritt County or right close by. Don't live in Lincoln. When I looked over your article, I had several questions come to mind. One of them, as proposed in Lincoln, I was trying to think of a scenario, and actually, it occurred to me that I was talking to somebody just a couple days ago who was down in Lincoln this week for the state basketball tournament, and they were in the stands, had a conversation, maybe a little louder than they wish they would have in hindsight. Were commenting on just questioning the gender of one of the players, and kind of got scolded. Now, if this was in effect, would a non-resident in that situation possibly be subject to this ordinance?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's a great question, great hypothetical, and the answer is yes.
Wow.
So just to briefly kind of explain what the ordinance does. So it takes a bunch of terms in our city code and really kind of redefines them. So they redefine the term sex to mean sexual orientation and gender identity, right? And it's illegal to discriminate based on someone's sex. They changed that to mean gender identity. But then the ordinance, you look at how they define discrimination, how they define harassment, and they use really broad terms. A specific example, that you gave, how the ordinance applies, is that the ordinance says that you would be guilty of harassment based on physical or verbal conduct. And verbal conduct is just a fancy way of saying speech. So if you say something that has the effect, not even the intent, but if it just has the effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment, you could be liable for harassment. So if you say something that has the effect of offending somebody, such as, the example you gave, or maybe misgendering somebody, not using the correct pronouns, talking about a biblical view of marriage. And the ordinance applies really broadly to public accommodations, which the ordinance defines as basically anywhere outside of your house. You could be liable for what the ordinance allows for, tens of thousands of dollars in fines. So it's really heavy-handed, and it's something that a lot of people, once they learn what the ordinance actually does, had a lot of questions and concerns about, because a lot of citizens could end up being punished simply for saying something that is politically incorrect, or even just for expressing their views on these issues.
So my mind goes to hypotheticals in these situations. Say that Paul and I, we road trip over to Lincoln, we're hanging out in the park, and maybe we decide we're just hanging out, waiting on somebody, and we're talking about scripture, talking about current events or whatever, and a passerby overhears us say something that would fall under the language of the ordinance. Does that put us at risk as well?
Well, here's what's interesting. It's kind of crazy, because the answer to that question is no, but here's why. Because you said if you were at a public park.
Okay.
And what's ironic about the ordinance is that the city council, in this ordinance, they exempted themselves. They took out any place that is funded by the government from the definition of public accommodations. So the example that you just gave, if you were at a coffee shop or a place that's, a private business that's open to the public, that would be an issue. But if you do it at a public park, it's not.
Okay, so just because I said park in that illustration.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. But that's what's so ironic about the ordinance.
But if we're hanging out, the same scenario, but we're hanging out at the mill, then we're fair game?
Correct. Then
Wow.
You would be fair game. But that's what's so ironic is they call it a fairness ordinance, but it applies to private schools, but not public schools. It applies to the business on Main Street, but not in City Hall. And that's not fair to anybody. It's a bad, poorly written ordinance to begin with. But the way that they set it up, if it's such a good ordinance that they think is necessary for the city, and yet they don't want to actually have to apply it to themselves or any city building.
What speculate for me? Why is that? Why were those exemptions put in place?
Well, that's one of the questions we've been asking of our city council, and of course, we've never really gotten an answer to that question. But the ordinance allows, for up to $10,000 for a first-time offense, $25,000 for a second offense, and $50,000 for any subsequent offense. So there's some serious liability that is being placed, particularly on employers and business owners. And I think they're just basically exempting themselves from any liability from anyone being able to make a claim of discrimination or harassment against the city. So they just don't have to deal with it. Because part of the issue, right, with this gender ideology is that it's impossible to define or to know, because it's just based on someone's internal feelings about how they choose to identify, which could even just change depending on the day. So it's not an ordinance, that makes a whole lot of sense, because when you redefine the term sex to mean everything, it basically means nothing. But the problem then is when you try to apply and enforce that as law, it makes it really difficult and challenging for people to, do correctly. And you get all these sorts of scenarios that you're describing and talking about, which we don't think is really good or beneficial for our city. So it's been a really big, just a big problem of trying to educate people, because the way they talk about the ordinance is very different from what the ordinance actually does. So it's really a battle of education and explaining to people what this is really about and what's at stake.
So a couple of questions about the content of it. I've already thrown a couple of hypotheticals at you, but so a pastor in front of his congregation simply reading a Bible verse that may not square with the current ideology, is that something that could put that pastor, that church in danger?
Yeah, it absolutely could. They could be liable if someone files a complaint that something that was said or done was offensive to them, or they felt like they were being discriminated against. Because again, the city council did with this ordinance is they applied it incredibly broadly, and they provided no type of exemptions other than for themselves. So it even could potentially apply to churches or be used against pastors just for teaching from the Bible about the issues.
Wow. Okay. Now, you said in your article that this ordinance is 67 pages long. That feels pretty heavy to me. What's the bulk of the 67 pages? What do they spend the bulk of the time focusing on over the course of 67 pages?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The ordinance is actually a complete overhaul of an entire chapter of our city code, and I think that was an intentional choice because the issues that we're talking about are specific consequences of the sexual orientation and gender identity language. There's a bunch of other changes and updates that they're making to the city code that are either just neutral or good, and no one has any problem with them. But the Soji issue isn't new. In fact, the Lincoln City Council tried to do a Soji ordinance 10 years ago, and it was blocked by the citizens of Lincoln, a referendum petition. And the city council was supposed to either rescind the ordinance or put it on the ballot, and they never did. And then 10 years later to today, they come back, and during this complete overhaul, they sneak this Soji language in to this 67-page ordinance. And I think I have to believe that wasn't an accident.
Right.
But unfortunately, for all the other changes that the ordinance makes, there's still these real serious problems stemming from the Soji language being included.
Okay. One more on the content, something that, in addition to everything else that is, makes me incredibly uncomfortable, says here that looks like the enforcement mechanism or the adjudication mechanism is a human rights commission. How much does the proposal say about that? And that's something that just feels, everything I've read, any place that has a human rights commission, it doesn't go well. What does that piece of it look like?
Yeah, that's another really important piece is that, when there's a complaint filed against somebody, the judge, jury, and executioner is this unelected human rights commission. It's basically nine unelected bureaucrats who get on the commission through being appointed by the mayor. And that's who gets to decide, who's guilty and who's not of discrimination and harassment, which under the ordinance could be, again, just as simple as not using the correct pronouns or not allowing biological men to use the women's locker room. That's who gets to make those decisions and impose potentially tens of thousands of dollars in fines, just an unelected commission that are appointed by the mayor, who has been strongly in support of the ordinance.
Wow. So not only problematic in the policy that's put in place, but problematic in the sense that you're almost creating a whole new legal system to carry it out. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's absolutely there's policy concerns, but there's also process concerns of just how this exactly is going to work and be enforced. As you've mentioned, just makes a lot of people uncomfortable and really question what our city council was doing with the ordinance. But again, it really comes back to ideology, and then ideology being pushed through law on society. They talk about it in very vague, generic terms, but when you actually look, when you get past, the slogans, in the political statements and look at what the ordinance actually does, how it works, what it allows for. When most people find out what's really going on, they've big problems with it, and rightfully so.
Wow. Okay. So we've been talking about the content of the proposal, but I know that since the article in National Review and since this kind of came out, there's been some developments, right? Can you get us up to speed just on what has happened since this was passed by the city council?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Lincoln City Charter allows for a petition referendum process, where when an ordinance is passed by the city council, it can't go into effect for 15 days. And if during those 15 days there is a petition drive collecting signatures, objecting to that ordinance, it says you have to get 4% of registered voters from the previous election to sign the petition. So we set out after the ordinance was passed to do a petition. We needed to collect 4,137 signatures in those 15 days. And when we hit that 15-day mark and we turned our petitions into the city, we actually turned in over 18,000 signatures. Over 18,000 citizens in Lincoln in 2 weeks signed our petition objecting the ordinance. And so now basically the ball is back in the hands of the city council, and they can either rescind this ordinance or they can put it on the ballot for citizens to vote on. Those are the options that they're given under our city charter. And we're waiting to see kind of what the next step is going to be by the city council. I don't think they were expecting to see 18,000 signatures on our petition. It sent a really loud, strong, clear message that this is not the type of ordinance or policy that people want or expect or that they think is fair. And so the city council is going to have to make a tough decision on if they're going to listen to people and rescind this ordinance. But at a minimum, the ordinance right now is unenforceable. And if the city council wants it to go into effect, the only way they can do that is if it gets approved by the citizens of Lincoln on the ballot.
And what would the timeline for that be if it goes that route?
Yeah, the city council can either choose to do a special election over this issue, where it'll just be a standalone special election on the ordinance, or they could add it to a general election ballot. And so that's what we're waiting to see what the city council decides to do. They're facing a lot of pressure, and they're hearing from a lot of constituents who want them to rescind the ordinance altogether. But I wouldn't be surprised if they really dig their heels in and try to force a vote on it. But either way, we think that this is an issue that's important enough that it shouldn't be just decided by the city council, especially when it goes so far beyond what the city council told the public about the ordinance. So we hope they do the right thing and rescind it altogether. And if they put it on the ballot, then we're going to continue to talk about what the ordinance actually does, why it's not good for the city of Lincoln, and try to educate voters to the best of our ability.
Okay. So what would you, so out here in Merritt County, Lincoln and Omaha seem a little far off, not really, but politically very different kinds of places. But often what goes on in Lincoln is a precursor for what might be coming our way in 3, 5, 10 years. What would you say in our church, we have people from Central City, Aurora, Grand Island. If something similar were to come to one of these smaller communities, is there anything proactive? Obviously prayer, obviously involvement, but anything you advise that we look for, or maybe when people are running for city council, specific questions that we could ask them? Most of our people here would prefer not to go the route that you've had to go in Lincoln. Any advice for us in that regard?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important that people, are paying attention. Being engaged really starts with being informed. But what I tell people all the time, what happens at our state capitol doesn't stay at our state capitol. This was done through the Lincoln City Council, but the implications are the same. If they feel like they can do this in Lincoln, they're going to try to do it other places as well. So I think you mentioned, making sure that you're making informed decisions when you go to vote is huge. That you're asking, candidates where they stand on these issues at the local level, because so much of the attention and focus, I think, at least from our media, really is on, what's happening in Washington, D.C., what Congress is doing, what the president said. But really, by and large, the decisions that impact your day-to-day life the most are made by your representatives at the local level, on your local school board, on your city council. And so it's critical that people in your own local communities are paying attention to what's going on in those meetings, what they're doing, and asking good questions, making sure you know where candidates for those positions stand on the issues that we're talking about before you vote them into office. And then I think just, continuing to stand for, the truth on this issue, because there's just so much, deception that's out there, that's being pushed in our culture, especially on young people. And we really need people who are willing, just through their own lives, by the way they live out their life, the way they go about their business, the way they talk to people, that they're pointing people, to why these issues matter, but also why what the Bible says about these issues matter too. Because I think, our world, our culture is just desperately searching for answers. And God has so graciously given us the answers to life's biggest questions. And so we just continually need to be living out our lives faithfully in a manner that points people to the truth of the gospel and shows both grace and love to our neighbor.
Yeah, Nate, one thing I had on my list here to ask you about, how do you set me up real nicely for something I'd been wanting to ask you about. You do a podcast yourself or have, and you have to speak to these issues in some pretty technical ways. But you also have to go out to eat, and you also have to live your life in Lincoln. And you encounter people who think dramatically differently about these things than you do, and I know that creates challenges. How do you, even if you don't do it perfectly, seek to walk in both grace and truth as you deal with ideas that really impact people, but also deal with the people themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something we all wrestle with, I think, right? Um, I think when we're dealing with these issues, or issues that are perceived as, either political or controversial, I think people tend to either, and this is a general statement, not always the case, but generally, people either overemphasize them and they make the most important thing in their lives, or in order to avoid, any type of controversy or maybe offending somebody, they retreat from it and neglect it altogether. And I think there are problems with both of those positions. And I think really where we need to be is just, thinking clearly and biblically through these issues. Politics should never be an idol or the center of our lives. But the answer to idolatry isn't neglect, right? I don't think being a faithful Christian or being a good steward of what God has given us requires us to neglect our duties and responsibilities as citizens. In fact, I think part of living the Christian life is engaging our culture and government with the knowledge and wisdom of Scripture. And so that can be a challenge in a society that politicizes everything. But I think it also provides an opportunity where, as believers, we can show that political engagement, the way we talk about these issues, can be done in a distinctly Christian way that shows both grace and truth, both love and mercy. And I think the last thing I would say is that most often when these issues get brought up, people tend to make them very personal. And I think trying to separate the policy from the person is also important, because most often there's a lot more that we agree with people, even on the other side politically. If we're able to just kind of break down some of those barriers and really get to some of the root causes of these issues, because I think at the end of the day, we all want, our community to be safe places for everybody to live, and enjoy their life with their friends, their families. And we don't need to necessarily always divide ourselves into these political camps. But that's a challenge. That's a challenge sometimes. So I think people who are willing to go out and have those hard conversations. But I think that starts with asking good questions,
Right.
Trying to get to the root of some of these issues. And I think that can really help people see that just because you fall to a different side politically doesn't mean that you can't still be a friend with that person, or at least just sit down and have that conversation.
Right. That's some good insight. But it is, like you said, it's a challenge, but something that Christ calls us to work on and to do. Nate, we're well over 28 minutes, and there's something else I was going to talk to you about that could take quite a bit of time. So I wonder if we can just sort of dive in, and at some point we're going to have to stop. But I know in the last year, and I think it's been about a year, the Nebraska Health Education Standards were released maybe around a year ago this time, and have been very controversial. Without me bringing it up, I've had people come and ask me about this. And if you could, maybe we'll just have time just to cover kind of the bare minimum. But one question I have is just a hypothetical to kind of frame this. If these health education standards that I know that Nebraska Family Alliance has talked about quite a bit, if those were proposed with nothing controversial, can you just explain from a process standpoint, like where those come from, how they would be implemented, how they would affect our schools? Just how does the system work, even if there was nothing controversial in those standards?
Yeah, absolutely. So the health standards, right? Yeah, that's been a huge issue this past year. So what's interesting about health standards is that the State Board of Education and the Department of Education are not required or obligated to do this. Under state law, they're required to create standards for English, reading, math, science, and social studies. And so the Nebraska Department of Education, they develop what they think the appropriate standards are for those subjects. They then present that to our State Board of Education, and the board then has the opportunity to vote to adopt those standards are put forward by the department. And from there, then that sets the standard, right, for what public schools in Nebraska are expected to be teaching in their schools. So with the health standards, again, just kind of disregarding the content of what was in them, if a set of health standards is approved by the Board of Education, that then sets the standard of what the people who are in charge of running education for the state of Nebraska think should be taught in our schools. Local schools could still determine what that curriculum looks like, but there's a lot of school districts just kind of grab onto and take hold of whatever the state board puts out, and it's clearly setting the bar for what they think should be taught. So it has a huge impact on schools across the entire state. So there's a lot at stake with whatever the state board does or does not decide to put in those standards.
Okay. So again, just for the sake of time, so this thing's a monster, and I'm just going to hold up. I've got every tab there represents a question that I have for you. And so we're not going to do it today, but I'm going to make it wide open from your perspective or the perspective of Nebraska Family Alliance. What are 2 or 3 of the biggest concerns about the content that's been proposed?
Well, I think the biggest things that stood out to us with what was put forward was one, the ideological and unscientific content that was in the standards, and secondly was the age and appropriateness of a lot of that content. I mean, literally, what was put forward was starting to teach this gender identity ideology in kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were proposing to start teaching, first graders about the concept of gender identity. They would be introducing, middle school students to hormone therapy and puberty blockers. They wanted to teach, eighth graders how to develop a plan to get an abortion. I mean, all sorts of really sensitive topics that they were proposing to start teaching at very young ages. And then the last thing I would, excuse me, the last thing I would add, in addition to the content, was who wasn't included in the process, and that was parents. There was no involvement, no oversight by parents in that process, and I think that's why we saw the type of standards that we did, and why we saw the type of pushback that we did was because parents were not invited in. And once parents saw what was being proposed to teach to their kids, that was a huge problem. So it was an issue with the content, but again, also the process. And so it's really, I think, spurred a huge awakening across our state. We're seeing more parents and grandparents and concerned citizens paying attention, not just to the state board, but their local board. People who are really stepping up to make sure that what's being taught to children in schools as good, in fact, and truthful is in fact good, in fact, and truthful, and not harmful to the minds, hearts, and bodies of kids.
Right. Yeah. Having read through this a couple times, I would co-sign everything that you just said. I just noticed a number of things that were internally contradictory, really, really problematic. You mentioned first grade. Even I've got in front of me a couple of items from the kindergarten standards. One of them, HEK.7.2.A, discuss different kinds of family structures, e.g., single parent, blended, intergenerational, cohabiting, adoptive, foster, same gender, interracial. As a father of five, I look at that, and not only am I a father of five, Nate, but I graduated from the Teachers College quite a while ago, and I would sit in class and look around me, and about half my classmates, I would say, yeah, they're okay. I trust my kids with them. About half my classmates, I would not. And so when I read this, I think, we're talking about this with kindergartners. That seems insane to me. And then second, who's having the conversation? As a parent, I've had to have some really delicate conversations with my kids, but they're my kids. Do I trust, someone who's qualified to teach kids math or reading or whatever? Do I trust them to affirm what I believe about these things with my kids? And so that's just a huge, huge red flag that I saw here. So Paul, anything you want to weigh in on at this point?
No, I was actually avoiding the whole conversation.
That's all right. So, Nate, so I appreciate that. Like I said, we could do 28 hours of sanity just going through this page by page. But can you tell us what is, at this point, it's kind of passed through a news cycle. At this point, what is the status of these health standards?
Yeah, that's a really important question because this continues to be an issue that gets brought up. So the state board did vote to basically table development of the standards. But since then, they've continued to revisit in conversations about going back and having a new set of health standards developed. They have not taken that off the table. So essentially, at any time, the State Board of Education could vote to bring that back and to direct the Department of Education to start developing health standards again. And we're expecting that to happen. There's been attempts, there's been motions made by one board member to permanently, take that issue off the table, to say this is something that we're not going to do, and that was rejected by the majority of the board. So we know that there's still an interest of certain state board members to pursue this. So it's something that we're continuing to watch really diligently, because it's not going away. It's going to continue to be an issue that gets brought up. And we think at some point in the near future, I would not be surprised to see another draft proposal of a new set of health standards. And so that's going to have to be really carefully vetted and reviewed. And ultimately, it's going to be up to parents to, again, push back on this stuff, and make sure that parents maintain that they're the primary educators of their children. And as you were talking about, JJ, that that you as the parent get to make sure that you're the one who's teaching your kids about these issues, and that we're not directing teachers or staff in schools to be doing that, especially at ages and in settings and environments that are just not appropriate or good for kids.
Okay. Well,
so stay tuned.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, so stay tuned. I think we'll be putting out information as we learn more, because it's going to be essential that the state board continues to hear from people if and when they do propose another draft.
Okay. Well, we've got your number, Nate. If it does come up again, we may have you come back on and do another deep dive into some of the details of this, because I think for our people, there's a real desire to understand, where's this coming from? How do we as believers talk about this? How do we deal with the process? Do you have counsel? Paul and I have good friends. Right here in town, we've got a great public school. We've got a great Christian school, and we're connected to leadership and boards at both schools. Do you have any particular counsel for people in school leadership as far as what to keep an eye on with this stuff?
Yeah, boy, we've had so many conversations with people who are working in schools or serving on local school boards. And I think it's important for people to know that, there are options, there are alternatives out there. There's great sets of curriculum that, teaches kids real health. I think what parents expect their kids to be taught, and not a lot of this ideology that we saw with the health standards. And I think too, what we saw was the more that we saw individual school boards, take a stand and put out a public statement or vote that they are not going to adopt the health standards that were put forward, it kind of created this snowball effect. And so I think people just need to know that they're not alone, that you can push back on the stuff that's being pushed, and know that you're going to get a lot of support from your community, from parents. But regardless of whether or not, how much of that support you feel or think is out there, it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. And ultimately, we're going to need more than ever people who are willing to step up and serve in our local school boards, to work in our schools, and to do the right thing, and to help shepherd the hearts and minds of our young school children, who really need that guidance at a time when culture and society is giving them all of the wrong answers and information. Because if we don't help them through these issues, someone else will. But it's not going to be in ways that are helpful or ultimately good. And so we need people to keep fighting on this, keep doing what's right, and know that we're out here at Nebraska Family Alliance to help you do that, to help give you information and to support you in any way that we can.
Well, just as a dad, Nate, let me say thanks for what you do. Thanks to Nebraska Family Alliance for bringing this stuff to the forefront. A lot of what we know about this is because of what you guys have done over the last year. So thanks much for doing that, and for continuing to stay vigilant and letting us know. Got one more policy type question for you. We had Michael Spencer on a Project Life Voice a few episodes ago, and I asked him about the Dobbs Supreme Court case, and he made a comment that I didn't quite have an answer to, and I was wondering if you did. He said that if Dobbs does result in a weakening or the defeat of Roe v. Wade, Michael said, I'm sure Nebraska has something ready to go if that happens. Can you speak to that? Do you know, are there things the legislature is ready to do if that Dobbs case is successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's actually something we're working on in anticipation of right now. Because unfortunately, the answer to that question, if Roe gets overturned or weakened, we actually do not have anything in place in Nebraska. If Roe gets overturned, abortion in Nebraska would still be legal up to 20 weeks. So we're trying to rectify that. We want Nebraska to be ready to protect all human life to the greatest extent possible if and when Roe gets overturned. So there's actually a bill that's been introduced this session in our state legislature. It's LB 933. It was introduced by Senator Joni Albright, and there was a committee hearing on that bill just a couple weeks ago. It actually is still remains in committee. So we're actually preparing to most likely see a pull motion where our full legislature will have the opportunity to vote to pull that bill out of committee so that it can be debated and voted on by our legislature this year. And the bill is very simple. It just says that when Roe v. Wade is overturned, or the state has more authority to regulate abortion, that all abortion in Nebraska will be prohibited, and every life will be protected. And so it's probably the biggest, most consequential pro-life bill we've ever had introduced in our legislature. So I would really encourage people. We've got information about it on our website, but please, especially over these next couple of weeks, if this is an issue you care about, reach out to your state senator and urge them to support LB 933, because we do believe that that time is coming when we'll see Roe v. Wade overturned, and we do want our state to be ready when that day comes.
Right. Well, I'm really happy that is something that's in place, and we will let people know about that and be in prayer about that. Nate, we're well over 28 minutes. I think we're going to wind it up here. I'd love to have you back on again sometime if you'd be able to. But can you just let us know you've mentioned it once or twice, but in closing, how can we, if somebody hears of Nebraska Family Alliance, how do we get your info or the stuff that you're putting out? How can we be connected to your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got lots of great information and resources on the things we've talked about today and a lot more. So you can find that on our website, which is nebraskafamilyalliance.org. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Nebraska Family Alliance. And we are, we're a nonprofit organization. We don't get any government funding or anything like that. We depend on, just citizens supporting us. We're a grassroots driven organization. And it's really a privilege to get to help represent and serve people across Nebraska at our state capitol when we're working on these issues.
Okay. Well, I sure hope, and I'm sure people will look you guys up and look more into what you do and offer a prayer for your work. Nate Grasz, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been 28 Minutes of Sanity. You can find us on Twitter at 28MIN of Sanity. Send us a note, 28minutesofsanity@gmail.com. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.